Hey everyone, this is Chris.
And Lorenzo.
And welcome to our Best of Saturday series. Now that we have hundreds of episodes, we get a lot of listeners asking us where to start.
So we'll be selecting some of our most popular episodes to share each Saturday from our years of podcasting. We hope you enjoy it.
No role plays, just real. Chris and Lorenzo share 4 decades of combined experience to help you become a more effective leader.
We've never really, as a workforce, spent a lot of time on making sure we're developing good leaders.
We'll be able to share stories, experience, mistakes, failures, successes.
This is Hacking Your Leadership.
Welcome to Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lorenzo.
And Lorenzo, on this episode, I'd like to talk a little bit about the concept of disruption. I know a lot of leaders who have kind of romanticized this concept of disruption, and not just leaders themselves, but the industry of leadership and the industry of the American workforce as a whole kind of romanticizes this concept of disruption. We kind of think that in order for meaningful change to happen, that it has to be disruptive change. It can't be incremental. It can't be evolutionary. It has to be revolutionary. But I think a lot of people and a lot of companies don't really know what that actually means, and they don't necessarily actually like it. They just like talking about it. Have you seen this in your career? We have leaders that like this, almost like disruption for the purpose of disruption, as opposed to what it's actually meant to be?
Absolutely. I think it gets covered up in terms like, we got to rock the boat and stir things up. And, like you have all this idea that there must be this massive shift in regards to how we approach something or how we act or how we talk to people or how we lead people. And that's what's needed to kind of get a team aligned and executing. And it's funny because as you were talking about it, like I think of how much of a wordy term it is now when you see like disruption. And I even, going through my social media feed, sometimes you get those ads at the bottom of a story and it's like, clearly it's based on some analytics of where you live, because it's always the same picture of some young kind of kids. And it says like, like my examples, like Orlando area, 3 people disrupt $300 billion industry,
Yes.
And I'm sure on your feed it says something like Los Angeles, or California. Like it changes, but it's the same article. But it's that idea that it requires this gigantic shift or adjustment away from what's currently happening. And so in many industries, in tech industries and things like that, I think it's more easily looked at as it's so different than what else is out there from a tech or from like a social media standpoint, that it's easy to point at that and say like, oh, look at how different that is. It's clearly like disruptive and an adjustment. But when it comes to people and leadership, I have not seen it be successful in regards to approaching teams and work.
Yeah, the disruptions that we never look positively on disruption when it's happening. We look back and think, oh, that was very disruptive, and look how much better we are for it now. There are companies and industries that change the way we live, and they are absolutely disruptive in nature in terms of how we end up living our lives, compared to how we did before that company or that industry. But when it's happening, no one recognizes it as disruptive. They just recognize it as this person's doing something different. In fact, I think a lot of people look at disruption when it's happening and they dismiss it. They don't even, not only do they not recognize it as disruptive, they look at it as not aligned with what got them success to begin with, and therefore not relevant. And so I think a lot of people dismiss, especially leadership in companies that are successful. So if you're already in an organization that's successful, anything that is disruptive to that way of doing business isn't looked at as a potential positive. I think it's looked at as a negative. I think some organizations and some leadership, they kind of squander potential opportunities because they don't look at the potential upside. They instead only look at, wait a minute, this is going to stop me from doing things the way we're doing them now. And right now we're doing okay, so this must be bad.
Yeah, it's funny how like the term disruption, which, in most instances, is somewhat tied, to kind of a negative concept. So you think of somebody as disrupting the class,
Of course.
somebody is causing a, public disruption. Like, like there's,
Yeah.
it's just the term that you're like, yeah, like something's going on over there that shouldn't be happening, or that's causing, a little bit of chaos. And I think that, when it comes to leadership and people, the times when I can immediately look back to either people that I've worked with, or people that I'm aware of, or whatever, and I think of like disruptive leaders, many times I don't have a positive feeling about that individual.
I agree.
It's kind of this
Yes.
idea that they came in, with this, very, loud voice and very, almost like antics and a lot of attention, a lot of noise, and trying to get people's, kind of focus on what they're doing or where they want them to go. And while that will work for some, I just never saw it be wildly successful in the long term. And as a matter of fact, some of those quote unquote disruptive people, end up losing jobs, losing careers, because of the fact that it was more about the act of disrupting than it actually was about creating change and approaching something differently.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we even had an episode, probably months ago now, about why is it that transformational leaders sometimes tend to be jerks? And it's around this concept of, in order to create massive change, you have to kind of stir the pot. You have to kind of rile people up. And that never happens. I think that is when a leader who is not a good leader looks back on how disruptive things ended up being positive in certain areas, and they think, okay, in order for me to be able to, put my stamp or my person on whatever change is about to happen, it has to be some massive shift. And they don't just realize that for disruption to be looked back on fondly, you can't recognize it as disruption in the moment. If it's recognized as disruption in the moment, it is not a positive thing. It's a negative thing. It's, wait a minute, we don't have clear direction here. We're kind of throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. We don't have a clear journey ahead of us. The times when people look back positively on it are times when it wasn't recognized in the moment as disruptive. It was just kind of trying something new or thinking outside the box. And it wasn't disruptive when it was happening. And the leaders that do those types of things, they're not trying to be disruptive. They just have an idea, or they have people that are allowed to have ideas and run with them and just see what happens. So it's not disruptive. It's kind of a quiet acceptance of, hey, you know what? The journey that we're on might be successful right now, but we don't know that it's going to be successful for 10 or 20 years. So it would behoove us to allow some of our employees to think outside the box and to think about other work streams, other potential revenue streams that could take us into the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love what you were talking about, because as you were talking through kind of that idea of being disruptive, and then like either the negative connotation to it or in the moment, like we have a shared mentor and somebody that I immediately thought of around like a disruptive leader, and
Sure.
and why I can look back and think about that was because he said things in the moment that sounded so different but were so inspirational and completely changed the dynamic of how people in the room looked at leaders and thought about leadership. That I of course would say that is a disruptive person, but with none of the negative elements. It wasn't done in a loud way. It wasn't done in a huge, like, egotistical, very big personality way whatsoever. It was simply done through language and through drawing a line in the sand to say, this is leadership, this is where we're going, and this is what I expect out of leaders, without ever saying those words exactly. And what he said, and I quoted it out in my book as well, was, there is somebody in this room who will be a better general manager than me one day, and my job is to find you and help you get there. right? Like that completely shifted the dynamic of the room, the culture of the environment. And to this day, it's how I think of being disruptive in a culture, in an environment, in a team, so much so that my most recent, implementation into a new team, I took the opportunity to have a meeting where everybody was there, and I talked about in full transparency that where the team was at was the result of a lack of quality leadership. I apologized for that and said, but this is the work that we're all going to do together, and it's okay for us to talk out loud about things that we have opportunities with, because that's the only way that we can fix them. And that was with the leaders in the room. And while people might say, man, that was awkward, or man, that was weird, we've never heard a leader talk like that before, what I wanted to do was cause a disruption around the fact that transparency, honesty, development, and real feedback will be the pillars of how we will move forward. And the fact that it may have been awkward in the moment, but how quickly that team was able to accept that message and then be able to provide and share real transparent feedback and thoughts are the things that allowed that team to very quickly shift into a place where it was all about culture, positivity, and performance.
I like that, but by definition, if that's disruption, it means it's something different than what they're used to. And so if that is the norm for those people, if they've never had a job before, let's say, or if they are used to that style of leadership for a long time, at what point does it become no longer disruption, but rather that's just the way we do business now? Is this transparent and airing problems together and solving them together differently than maybe it might be traditional in the American workforce? But for something to be disruptive, it has to be different than what was going on. And so at some point, if this is the way things are used to being done, it's not really disruptive anymore.
No, absolutely. I think at this point now, fast forward, a year or so, and you're right. Like now the disruptive thing would be lack of transparency, right? Lack
Right.
of development and collaboration, lack of these types of things. And I think that in my career over time, I've seen that happen. I've seen that where you've had leaders, in a business for a while, have the ability to, when they got there, become disruptive as a result of the way that they lead and they handle, situations, and they look at employee development, things like that. And then when that leader leaves, if the next leader at minimum doesn't have the same shared values and the same ideals of what success are, even if it's done slightly differently or in a different approach, if the shared values are there, then I think you have some maintenance in what was happening cultural, and then many times you have some growth because of that. I think if the next leader that comes into that team or that organization maybe doesn't have those same shared values or those same shared ideals, that's when you then have disruption again, but usually in a different direction. And it's not to say that it's necessarily good or bad. Sometimes I think most of the time, if the initial disruption and where the team is at has all the right values, then it can be a bad thing. I think that if where this next leader comes in, if they shake any of those types of pillars, then yes, many times, that's when teams break up. That's when you have turnover. That's when you then kind of have to reassess what that culture looks like. But I think that you're spot on, is that when those things become the norm, the only thing that can disrupt them now is a different direction in those types of core values.
Well, yeah, people naturally want to be in environments where if they want to have an opinion or a voice, they're allowed to. Some people don't necessarily want to speak up. They don't necessarily want to have an opinion, but they at least want to be in an environment where if they decide to one day, it's welcome. Nobody wants to feel like that's not a possibility for them. And so I know people who will work semi-engaged, doing a good job for poor leaders for a long time because they never had a good one. And then they have a good one and it kind of ruins them, meaning for the good. It ruins them in that they realize what they won't tolerate anymore. It's like, wait a minute, I've been doing it this way my entire career because I've had this type of leader and I thought this was just the way it is. And then they experience a leader who does things the other way, the transparent way. They get the leadership style is disruptive for the better. And now that employee almost has, the veil pulled away and now they don't know how to put it back on again. It's like you can raise a bird in captivity from the beginning in a cage, but good luck trying to put one in a cage that lived half its life outside. And that person's going to shut down. Going back to the way it was, they will see that contrast very, very clearly. And a lot of times either that new leader that comes in without those values is going to be ousted if the team has some really great cohesion, or if the team doesn't have great cohesion, then you're going to have your best and most productive and most engaged players quickly exit that environment, and then the performance is going to take a turn for the worse.
Yeah, no, I think it really highlights the importance when you think about like larger organizations, or like the true impact when you have layers of leadership up, like, in regards to executives, senior vice presidents, vice president, things like that. Like when you've got, even all the way up to a CEO, when you've got senior leadership that can clearly not just talk through the values of the organization, but then you see it in those leaders, in how they speak, how they treat one another, how they treat their direct reports, and so on and so forth, how they engage with the larger workforce. I think when you have senior leaders like that really set the tone for what the values are over the organization, what's expected of leadership, what's expected of engagement. I think that's the thing that, to what you were just saying, that somewhat, not necessarily eliminates, but greatly reduces the risk of having leaders within an organization, that when there is changes, that there becomes this massive disruption in the wrong way or in the wrong direction. I think that that's really where greater leadership has the most influence on how that happens throughout the org.
Yeah, well, the leaders that do that are the ones that kind of allow for disruption in their industry to occur naturally and like it should, meaning disruption isn't something that turns the organization on its head, but rather disruption is something where the leaders can kind of quietly recognize that something is happening, and they don't know if it's going to turn into anything or not. But the worst thing they can do is shut it down. The second worst thing they can do is to allow it to go without kind of helping it along, and without fostering good leadership in the moment, to where they don't know how to react to it or capitalize on it when it comes to fruition, if it ends up being this a great idea, or potentially a new way of doing business that the company's not used to.
Yep, I completely agree. And with that, it brings us to this episode's 1 Minute Hack.
The 1 Minute Hack.
Okay, this episode's 1 Minute Hack is going to be about how to make sure that you as a leader are allowing for potential disruption to occur without it getting out of hand, and without it, kind of derailing the relationship between you and your direct reports. And so if you're in an environment, your direct reports are naturally going to be thinking about ways to do things outside the box, especially if you've set up the environment as such to where the leadership is strong, and people's opinions are welcome, and it's a transparent environment. So there's 3 things you want to remember whenever an employee either has an idea or potential of doing things that don't really fit inside the box of how business is done right now. The first is going to be gratitude. So when a person takes the time to think outside the box, to come up with an idea, whether it's huge or whether it's tiny, you want to be grateful to them for that. You want to thank them specifically for caring enough about the job and the company to not just go about their day job every single day. Even if the idea is terrible, the fact that they thought about it and that they took the time to put something together, even if it's just in their head, that's a good thing. It's a sign of engagement, and it's a sign that the employee wants to make things better, even if it's not well thought out. The second thing is you want to have an ask. So the best way to determine whether or not that employee just wants to kind of be disruptive, or if they actually have an idea they want to run with, is to give an ask to them. Ask them to do something in regards to it, whether it be to partner with a certain person, or write down what their ideas are to kind of think it through and kind of hash it out a little bit and come back to you on it. And then make sure that they actually want to do that, because if they don't, if it's just if their goal is just disruption for the sake of disruption, they're not going to put the time and effort into doing that thing. If they actually have a great idea in their head that they think is going to better your business or your industry, they will have no problem taking the time to kind of hashing it out on paper, writing out the potential pitfalls or the potential successes on this, and they'll come back to you with that. And then the third thing is a follow-up. You want to make sure that you as the leader follow up with them on what that ask was, to make sure that they understand that you're committed not to their idea, but to them. As long as you're committed to them and the fact that they're allowed to do this when they want to, you're going to have a great relationship with that employee, even if that idea or that potential idea doesn't go anywhere. That's how you set the construct of an environment where people are allowed to try new things. And who knows, one day one of those ideas may be looked back on as an amazing disruption in the moment, but you won't recognize it when it's happening, and that's the good kind of disruption.
Yeah, I think it's a great 1 minute hack, and it's really important to, as you talk through, like, while again, disruption, there's a lot of subjective thoughts on what does that mean and how big can that be and that type of thing. I think the idea is that you always want to have your teams engaged around sharing ideas, sharing feedback, sharing insight, and especially those employees that are thinking about how can I make things better. Even if their approach to it or their positioning to what they want to do may not be the best, at the end of the day, they care enough to make a change to help the collective, and you definitely want to be able to really promote that type of an environment and really thank people that go out of their way to think about ways to make things better.
Yeah, that's so true. For every one disruption we look back fondly on because it made our lives better or it changed an industry, there are countless ones that we don't talk about that were disruptive and led to failure. Disruptions that led to the ousting of leadership or the failures of entire companies. And we don't look at those as disruptions. We look at those as failures of leadership or failures of company. But at the end of the day, they were disruptions. But a lot of them were disruptions for the sake of disruption, as opposed to just trying to be open-minded to potential new work streams and potential new ways of doing business. Those are the ones that don't necessarily get recognized in the moment.
Absolutely. And with that, it brings us to the end of this episode. This is Hacking Your Leadership. I'm Lorenzo.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you all next time.